Good morning, everyone. As you're getting settled in for our keynote lecture, I want to welcome everyone to the American College of Chest Physicians' 77th annual chest meeting in beautiful Honolulu. I'm David Gutterman, currently president of ACCP for a few more hours. This year we are truly a global meeting with a multifaceted lineup of educational activities, including our highly acclaimed hands-on simulation sessions, problem-based learning, and a variety of groundbreaking clinical and research presentations. You can learn more about this at the Experience ACCP booth in the Clinical Resource Center. But you probably already know that. But what you might not realize is that during this meeting, a cadre of our faculty experts will visit several Hawaiian hospitals, participating in grand rounds, critical care debriefings, and providing education to primary care physicians on COPD. Also new this year in the exhibit hall is the ACCP Centers of Excellence. This is an innovative set of displays that highlight use of technology to achieve superior outcomes in patient care. Come and see the innovations from the practices across the country, talk to those who actually implemented these innovations, and take back what you learned to your own practice. I would now like to ask Kevin Chan, the Chair and Master Architect of CHEST 2011, to say a few words.
Thank you, David. And on behalf of the program committee for this CHEST 2011, I'd like to also say aloha and welcome to all of you to this wonderful meeting. I also have to thank you for entrusting our organization to provide excellent CME opportunities in pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine, and to enjoy the simulation center and all of the innovative educational opportunities that we can provide to you. Without your input, the changes that we have made, such as increasing the amount of educational opportunities in the area of sleep medicine, critical care medicine, as well as other areas in pulmonary and critical care medicine, would not have occurred. I encourage you to continue to give your ideas to the program committee, and we will implement them. To remember that this is your program, and I want you to extremely enjoy the wonderful hospitality of Hawaii, and I'm very glad that you're here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. I now would like to ask Dr. Stephanie Levine, the president of the CHEST Foundation, to say a few words.
Thank you and welcome. I'm pleased to be here today representing the CHEST Foundation Board of Trustees and staff to inform you about the Foundation's exciting new One Breath campaign. I hope that you will consider joining One Breath, a free value-added resource for ACCP members, their patients, and their communities. The goal of the One Breath campaign is to improve lung and heart health by providing valuable prevention resources, raising public awareness, and encouraging healthy behaviors. One Breath provides a wide spectrum of resources, prevention tools, and a family activities toolkit that can be used by both you and the public. Membership is free. There are 3 ways for you to become a One Breath member. You can scan the QR code found on One Breath cards into your smartphone, and those are available throughout the meeting. You can sign up at the CHEST Foundation booth in Experience ACCP, or you can go to onebreath.org and hit the Become a Member button. I look forward to your participation in the One Breath campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. This morning, we are adding a new page to the history of American healthcare. Last year, in the United States Department of Health and Human Services and the Critical Care Societies Collaborative, of which the ACCP is a member, developed a new awards program to recognize healthcare teams that achieve the greatest success in reducing healthcare-associated infections in critical care. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Dawn Wright, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health and Healthcare Quality in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, who will present awards to 3 winners today. Dr. Wright?
Thank you, David, and good morning. Good morning to my fellow clinicians, and a special good morning to the recipients of this award for reducing healthcare-associated infections in the ICU setting. Let me say it's a distinct privilege to be with you today on behalf of the Assistant Secretary of Health, to present these awards to today's award winners. This award celebrates outstanding leadership and sustained progress in the national effort that was initiated in 2008 to ultimately eliminate healthcare-associated infections, and that was enumerated in the HHS Action Plan to prevent healthcare-associated infections. The action plan tries to improve coordination of the federal agencies around reducing healthcare-associated infections, but also reaches out to partner with external stakeholders to reach that lofty goal. Let me say it was out of that in 2010 we issued a call for proposals across the United States to work with external groups to reduce these infections. We received a number of proposals, and I was very pleased to accept and move forward with the proposals submitted by the Critical Care Society Collaborative to recognize achievements in eliminating healthcare-associated infections in the ICU setting. This particular award recognizes teams of critical care professionals who have achieved notable improvements in the prevention of HAIs and motivated other clinicians to improve practice patterns in order to achieve similar results. As a quick diversion, let me say last week we received some very encouraging news in our effort to reduce healthcare-associated infections. The Center for Disease Control released their trend data on healthcare-associated infections in hospitals across the nation for the year 2010. And I'm very pleased to report that nationwide we experienced a 33% reduction in central line-associated bloodstream infections. More specifically, that was 35% reduction in the ICU setting and 26% a reduction among non-critical care patients. In addition, nationally, there was a 7% reduction in catheter-associated urinary tract infections, a 10% reduction in surgical site infections, and an 18% reduction in invasive MRSA infections. So clearly a good report across the United States. I've had the opportunity to work in health and health policy for the last decade of my career, and let me say that large-scale success is a rare accomplishment from preventive initiatives, especially those that require behavior change both in the individual and in the institution. Yet here we are 2 years later after implementing a national strategy and are announcing sizable reductions. I really don't know how you would explain these notable reductions. I think there are perhaps many factors, but clearly the one that is most important is the care that each and every one of you give every day at the patient's bedside. So I commend you for that and look forward to continued reductions in these infections moving forward. You know, regardless of who gets credit for these notable reductions, let me say that to the extent that HAI reductions translate into lives saved and health maintained, everyone is a winner. At the national level, HHS remains focused on reducing healthcare-associated infections and is now expanding our scope to include ambulatory surgical centers, end-stage renal disease centers, and very shortly, long-term care facilities as well. I think many of you are aware of the landmark legislation called the Affordable Care Act, and starting in October of 2012, a year from now, Medicare will reward hospitals that provide high-quality care for their patients through the new Hospital Value-Based Purchasing Program. This program marks the beginning of a historic change in how Medicare pays healthcare providers and healthcare facilities. And for the first time, hospitals across the country will be paid for inpatient acute care services based on the quality of care, not just the quantity of care that they provide. I think all of the winners of today's awards exhibit the type of care that Medicare wants to incentivize. All of you are part of that overall effort, and it's really a pleasure to present these awards today. At this time, I want to start with the Outstanding Leadership Award for achievement in eliminating ventilator-associated pneumonia. The first winner goes to Seton Medical Center in Dale City, California, which reduced VAP in both the intensive care units and the cardiac care units by implementing an expanded VAP bundle and ICU observance of strict hand hygiene for each and every patient. So if Seton Hospital will come up, we'll give you present your award. I'm also honored to present the Sustained Improvement Award for achievements in eliminating VAP to St. Joseph's Hospital, Orange, California, which more than 45 months ago posted a sign stating the last time they caused harm to a patient related to VAP. The VAP rate at St. Joseph's Hospital decreased to 0 soon after implementation. Clinical outcomes also included a decrease in overall length of stay by 9%, and a corresponding decrease in observed versus expected mortality by 32%. So congratulations to St. Joseph's Hospital. Also receiving the Sustained Improvement Award for achievements in eliminating VAP is Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena, California. Huntington's ICU applied with a downward trend of VAP since 2004 and a sustained 0 VAP instance since November 2008. Their elimination of VAP in 2008 is credited to refocused prevention efforts and revision of oral care protocols. The elimination of ICU VAP in the ICU alone in 2008 equated to a savings of almost $500,000 when compared to earlier benchmarks. So congratulations to Huntington Memorial Hospital. Another winner of the Sustained Improvement Award, but at a different level, for achievement in eliminating VAP and central line-associated bloodstream infections is Salem Healthcare Critical Care Services of Salem, Oregon. Salem's critical care multidisciplinary team used scientific measurement, evaluation, and improvement methods across a decade. They monitor these applications on a daily basis because of their belief that surveillance and practice habits must be continually refined. So congratulations to Salem Health Critical Care Services of Salem, Oregon. I also want to point out that also receiving the Sustained Improvement Award for achievement in eliminating VAP, but unfortunately not represented here today, are Providence St. Mary's Medical Center of Walla Walla, Washington, and Palmdale Regional Medical Center of Palmdale, California. Certainly these institutions will be recognized and their awards will be sent to the appropriate location. Let me close again by expressing my thanks for the opportunity to honor these Vanguard institutions with you here today in this nice setting, and best wishes to all your organizations, and I hope to have the opportunity to present more of these awards recognizing outstanding achievement in upcoming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright, for your vision and leadership in helping us implement this award program. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sherwin Nuland, our keynote speaker. Dr. Nuland serves on the faculty at Yale School of Medicine as clinical professor of surgery. For 3 decades, he practiced as a surgeon and considers this his most important and personally fulfilling work. A prolific author, Dr. Nuland has written pieces for many periodicals. His monumental successful book, How We Die, was on the New York Times bestseller list for 34 weeks, with more than 500,000 copies, now 500,001 sold. Dr. Nuland is well known for enlightening audiences on his research, scholarship, philosophy, and vision of the future of medicine. Now, I learned of Dr. Nuland while driving back and forth to work. I had purchased a teaching company CD program in which Dr. Nuland brilliantly narrates a history of medicine through biography from Hippocrates to Tausig, and here's a copy of it. This one belongs to Sue Pendleton, but I encourage you to get one, or I'm saving it for her. This was probably the most captivating book on tape or in print that I've ever experienced. He talks of Galen, Harvey, Lister, Virchow as if he personally knew them. You really feel like you are in their world. And the intertwining of the medical and the historical insights are riveting and quite compelling. However, Dr. Nuland, I must mention there is one problem with these tapes. And that is my drive to work is about 20 minutes, and each vignette is 30 minutes. So on a number of occasions, I was late to morning meetings because even though I got to work on time, I couldn't tear myself away from the car until the CD was finished. So should you decide to produce some more tapes, please let me know. I need to move 10 more minutes away from work so I can sync things better. Most recently, I read Dr. Nuland's book, Lost in America, which offers an autobiographical insight centered around his relationship with his father. Various readers have commented on this book as being moving, sensitive, beautifully written, a searing memoir and eulogy of love, a marvelous read. I was similarly captivated by Dr. Nuland's incredible writing style, his honesty, and unconditional command of the reader's attention. One expert critic commented that this is definitely Nuland's best literary work. Dr. Nuland will be providing signed copies of this book, or we will have them available at 11:15 to 12:15 in the Experience ACCP Clinical Resource Center. So please come early to avoid the lines. But now Dr. Nuland is going to talk to us about a new concept that he's been developing entitled The Goodness of the Physician from Hippocrates to High Tech. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Sherwin Nuland. Dr. Nuland, I want to give you a quick token of appreciation of Lay.
Oh, my.
And a pen and pencil set for writing your next book.
Thank you so much. Oh, my God. I feel like I've just won the Nobel Prize, or better yet, a daytime Emmy. Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction, David. Like so many of you today, I suspect just about everybody here today, I woke up this morning jet-lagged. It's 6,000 miles from New Haven, Connecticut. But I thought better to be jet-lagged at the Honolulu Hilton than to be wide awake at Motel 6 in Bridgeport. So this is a real privilege for me for a number of reasons, not only the opportunity to speak about some of my research before such a distinguished group, but also because I look for opportunities and carefully choose the people to whom I talk about this research, which has been going on for 3 years, and I've talked about it 2 or 3 times. Fortunately for me, because I have the opportunity to be with people of the sort who are here this morning and who will be here for the rest of the week. I've been struck for many years, and certainly I'm not the only one, because it's been written about over and over again, about the effect of personal morality, the physician's personal morality, his or her image to the patient, the effect of that on the patient's ability to recover, and not only to recover, but to recover in a way that is more lasting, perhaps, than other kinds of recoveries. And so one day I decided, why don't I historically look back on this tradition and see what our colleagues have thought about it over the millennia. As you know, Western medicine, of course, begins with the Hippocratic authors, about 350 before the Common Era, a guild of physicians who were known by the name of Hippocrates, even though we hardly have any idea of who Hippocrates was. They contributed certain brand new things to the notions of medical understanding, medical science, which they called natural philosophy of healing, and medical thought. One of them was the separation of health from the influence of the gods, which had been thought to be preeminent for so long. We all know the name of Asclepius and his rod and the serpent spinning around the rod from which we get our own. It's not really a caduceus, but we call it a caduceus. They saw healing as something that involves the use of the natural methods of our surroundings, the uses of nature, that disease came from aberrations within somebody's nature and not because one of the gods, and in their case it was, of course, Asclepius, Apollo, and perhaps Apollo's daughters, who had the names, get this, Hygeia and Panacea. So they used natural methods as much as they could, but they did many other things too. They wrote records so that people could learn over the generations from these records. They kept patient records. They kept sort of healing philosophy records based on very accurate observation of clinical signs. They were the first to develop the physical examination and an evaluation of symptomatology. They were interested in prognosis. Now, it was a selfish interest. If an itinerant physician who was a Hippocratic came along to a town and had a reputation for not treating people who weren't going to survive anyway, his reputation was greater, people were more likely to come to him, but prognosis became a very important part of their healing armamentaria. But what they are most remembered for by most of us is their code of ethics. And I don't mean only the oath, which is a relatively minor part of their code of ethics, but a group of books. There are about 70 Hippocratic books actually written about over a period of 200 years. Some of them have names like the law, on decorum, the physician, and precepts. This concept of the morality of the physician being important begins actually with them. For example, I'm going to quote a few things from some of their books. Quote, "With purity and holiness I will pass my life and practice my art." They did believe in the gods, but they did not believe that the gods had any influence whatsoever on disease or on healing. Here's another one from the book Precepts. Where love of mankind is, there is also love of the art of medicine. That's something we ought to continue to think about. From a book called Epidemics, that famous phrase, and it doesn't come from the Hippocratic Oath, it comes from Epidemics, to help, or at least to do no harm. And then one of my favorites, and I have the feeling that virtually every physician in this room has had an experience of this one. This comes from the book Precepts. Some patients, though conscious that their condition is perilous, recover their health simply through their contentment with the goodness of the physician. And those words, the goodness of the physician, which is what I call the study I've been doing, come from specifically this bit of text. I'd like to give you an example of my own experience, one of my early experiences with the goodness of the physician influencing the course of a patient's recovery. And I chose this one because it will be appreciated, I think, particularly by a group of chest physicians. In the year 1965, 64 or 65, I was a brand new attending on the surgical service at the Yale New Haven Hospital, and I was asked to see a patient on the medical service whose name was William Sloane Coffin. In New England, of course, we've got a lot of people named William Sloane Coffin. It's sort of the ideal that everybody aspires to, no matter what your name was when you started your life. But in any event, he was the descendant of a well-known Yankee family and was the director of all religious philosophy studies, essentially the chaplain of Yale University, and he was a very popular man. He was a man who devoted his life to moral justice, to civil rights. Frequently, during those active days of the civil rights movement, would get on a bus and go down to Mississippi or Georgia. It would disappear for weeks at a time, and we knew where Bill Coffin was. And one day he came back from having been imprisoned in a dank Georgia or Mississippi jail, came back with a very high fever, was admitted to the medical service of the Yale New Haven Hospital, and a simple chest x-ray showed a complete whiteout of his left chest. He clearly had an empyema. His fevers were running 102 to 103 every day. The internists were putting needles into this chest, trying very hard to get a sample of fluid, and they weren't getting anything. Well, of course, when an internist wants to have highly skilled and highly intellectualized help, calls the surgeon. You know, the surgeon who always stops the closing doors of an elevator with his head because his hands are too precious. But in any event, so they called the new young hotshot on the surgical service, and that was me. And I thought, you know, smirkingly as I walked down the corridor to Bill Coffin's room, they don't know what they're doing. I'll show them how to do this just right. So I took a needle that was about 4 times the bore of what they had been using. I did my old trick of going 2 interspaces lower than they ordinarily went, and then 2 interspaces higher, and then right in the middle where all the puncture wounds were, nothing came out, nothing at all. It was clearly a loculated empyema. His white count was way up in the air. Day after day, the fevers were getting higher and higher. And finally, after about 5 or 6 days of this, I went in and I told him he needs a procedure that probably almost no one in this room has ever seen. It's rarely done, called a decortication, where you open the chest up and you peel the parietal pleura away and you peel all the adhesions away. You get the pus out, you let the lung expand, it sticks to the chest wall, and it is very, very dangerous. In those days, it had a mortality of 25–30%. And he was a very stoic fellow, physically and morally courageous, had been in the OSS during World War II, as a matter of fact, the predecessor of the CIA, and in his usual stoic way, he said, "Fine, Doc, let's do it." He had a very deep, powerful voice, sort of God's voice, as I would imagine it. So I scheduled the procedure for a Wednesday morning, and 7 o'clock on Tuesday evening, I came to see him for the usual final talk before the operation, had him sign the operative permit. Those were the days when the surgeon himself, very few herselfs, got the operative permit. Yes, himself, instead of asking the lowest ranking medical student to get it. And I came on the ward, and his 7 o'clock temperature, which was really the 8 o'clock temperature, but they took it at 7, was 98.6. First time in all the time he had been in the hospital. And the physical examination remained the same, and I said, you know, I think I'd better cancel your operation. I'll reschedule it for Friday, and we'll watch you. He never had a degree of temperature again, of fever again. Well, he got out of the hospital 3 weeks later. His chest film had rapidly cleared all by itself. There had been no change in antibiotics from the different changes he had had before. And I didn't see him again for 2 years. Ours is not a big campus, but for some reason I had not run into him. And I ran into him at a faculty wedding where he was the officiant. And amidst all the noise and hubbub of the reception, I went up to him and I said, I didn't call him Bill, actually. I never had the temerity to call him Bill. I said, "Reverend Coffin, there must be some explanation for how you got better." and he was about 2 inches taller than I. He looked down at me, even though I was a lot taller then than I am now. And he said, well, I did it for Bezzazero. Bezzazero. It was really noisy. I thought he said Beelzebub. I thought our Reverend Mr. Coffin was trucking with the devil. And I said, say it again. He said, I did it for Bezzazero. I couldn't let him down. Then I suddenly remembered. Joe Bezzazero was the intern taking care of Reverend Coffin. Every single evening, whether he was on or off, Joe would come into the minister's room and sit down and talk about philosophy, talk about Greek history, talk about music, talk about this kind of thing. They had developed a very close friendship. And here was Bill Coffin, who knew nothing about medicine, saying, I had to get better for Bezzazero. I couldn't let him down. An extraordinary thing. But to me, an example of this statement that by that time I had studied for quite a while. Some patients, although they know their condition is perilous, recover simply because of their contentment with the goodness of the physician. Throughout the Greek corpus of 70 books, the Hippocratic corpus, we hear talk of compassion, empathy, honesty, virtue as being important factors in health. Judgment, of course, but judgment could only come to those who were virtuous and honest and treated people with a degree of empathy that was remarkable for its time because that did not exist among the non-Hippocratic physicians. You remember the great expression, the first aphorism of Hippocrates, the art of medicine is long, life is short. No doctor can learn everything. Experience is delusive. Opportunity is fleeting. Judgment is difficult. And everybody in this room knows that it is judgment that makes us the doctors that we are and not the latest spec scan. Now, this kind of notion of compassion and the importance of the physician, because after all, there were very few medications that were worth anything at that time. That was transferred over the next few centuries through the Greek-speaking physicians into the Roman Empire, where all educated physicians spoke Greek. There were not a lot of educated physicians, but there were enough, to a man named Galen who studied anatomy and physiology but believed in the same ideas of treatment. Now, when Rome fell in about 470 of the Common Era, you'll recall that the great Greek philosophical, natural philosophical, so scientific and literary writings were transferred to Constantinople, where the Eastern Empire was. They were not studied very much. But who found them? Who found them? The next great civilization to appear. As Christianity descended into the Middle Ages, which for medicine really was the Dark Ages, it was the Arab civilization that took them over. After Muhammad's birth in 578 and throughout the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, medicine was in the hands, the very capable hands, of these inheritors of the Greek tradition, namely the great Arabic physicians Avicenna, Rhazes, Ibn Nafis, who discovered the pulmonary circulation a few hundred years before William Harvey was born, people like Maimonides, my own personal favorite. But still, as you read the writings of these men, they are talking about the importance of personal morality, personal virtue, personal goodness, empathy, and actually a number of the pillars of modern bioethics long before bioethics with a capital B existed. We move into the Renaissance, of course, which was characterized by the rediscovering of the Greek writings, turning back to Greek civilization and the study of the human body, which we call humanism. And as we read through some of those works, again, everything is coming back. the Greek concepts of the goodness of the physician having an effect on the way a patient heals. I think of Giovanni Morgagni, who lived during the era immediately following the Renaissance, the so-called Enlightenment, or as the Germans call it, die Erklärung, the clearing up of all the webs and confusions of superstition and the effect of religion. The Muslim and Jewish physicians of the Middle Ages had been just like the Greeks. They may have been very religious people, but they did not believe that God interfered in small things in the world, certainly not in health. That's what doctors were for. Doctors were the deputies of God who didn't become involved except in very rare instances. But now this is beginning to come back during the Enlightenment to Christian Europe. Giovanni Morgagni had 12 children. 6 of them became nuns, all of them in cloistered orders, some of them in orders where no further speaking was allowed. He was the one who first told us what the relationship was between the inner changes in the body and symptoms. He referred to symptoms as the cries of the suffering organs. And this all came from his own personal compassion, his own devout Catholic faith, but here he was with a devout Catholic faith, but again, not looking upward for causes of disease or cures. We then move very quickly, his book was written in 1761, we move very quickly to the American Revolution, to the French Revolution. The winds of change are everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of young people in France are pouring into Paris, some of them to whom medicine was never available as a profession become doctors. It is no longer a profession only for the privileged or people who have connections, but it is a profession for anyone with real intellectual quality. And we find ourselves in the second decade of the early 19th century in a small hospital on the outskirts of Paris called the Necker Hospital. And there was a great deal of tuberculosis. As you know, at that time, Necker was mostly a chest hospital. Another example of what I'm talking about that I chose specifically because we're all here thinking about the chest, its contents, its implications. And the physician in charge of the chest unit, which was the major unit there, was a 5'2" Frenchman whose name was René Théophile Hyacinthe Laennec. Imagine the effect of being a short man whose middle name was Hyacinth. He had no sense of self-confidence. He was shy. Eventually never married till he was 42, and he married his housekeeper. And she became pregnant right away. You can imagine all those years he'd been waiting for this moment. So, but he was very shy. That was the important thing. And one day he's making rounds, and there were these hospitals, especially the Necker, filled with young people with tuberculosis. Everybody has seen La Bohème and Traviata, the last aria sung while someone is coughing up a 6-pound tubercle, this kind of thing. And he was developing physical examination, as many were in those days. The notion of listening, of auscultation was so important, and the way they did it, of course, was to put the ear directly on the chest. Now, these were people, the patients by and large, who were, although they lived in the city, were essentially of a peasant mortality. Frenchmen, by and large, at that time, were bathed 3 times in their lives. Once when they were born, once the night before they got married, and once before they were buried. After riding the Paris metro a few times, I've begun to wonder whether that still goes on in France. And Laennec comes across a lovely young woman of about 19 or 20, very buxom, endowed by nature with many of the qualities that he hadn't married at this point, this frustrated 30-something-year-old fellow admired. but he can't bring himself to put his ear on her chest because he's got to listen just below her breast. She's smelly and dirty, but she's very attractive, and he mumbles something and says, well, we'll continue rounds tomorrow, and he goes rushing off home. He, in his travels home, passes through the courtyard of the Louvre, which at that time was a palace, and he sees some boys playing a game that he used to play when he was a small boy. A 10-foot 2x4, essentially, is held between the ears of, well, the ear of one boy is at one end of it, the mouth of another boy is at another end of it, but the other boy is holding a pin or a needle of some kind, and he scratches prearranged signals, and the fellow who is listening is supposed to interpret those signals. And he looks at these kids and he thinks, ah, sacre bleu, I have it. And he calls a passing cab, a cabriolet, of course, as they called them, rushes back to the hospital, takes a notebook, rolls it up, and puts it under the left breast of this young woman. And he hears sounds like he's never heard before, even with his bare ear, and with that, in one fell swoop, he has invented the stethoscope, which at first was a long wooden cylinder. In fact, one of its original names was Le Cylindre, and he begins writing about the different sounds and what they mean and how they should be interpreted. In 1819, he writes the famous book on mediate auscultation. Well, here we are with a profession who has depended on history, on physical examination, on physical and mental and emotional closeness with patients, and all of a sudden, there is this tube, at that time about 10 to 12 inches long, and there are many comments about the usefulness or lack of usefulness. Some people couldn't hear all the sounds he described. Some people heard too much. Some people said it'll impress patients. Some people said it'll scare patients. But a couple of sages or seers said, you know, and they wrote this is the first time that anything physical has come between us and our patients. This is a metaphor. Things are going to change. We're going to distance ourselves. And lo and behold, throughout the 19th century, the attitude of physicians is characterized by what historians call therapeutic nihilism, therapeutic nothingness. There wasn't much you could do anyway, but everything is focused on diagnosis. Patients are thought of as fodder for the scientific mill. When one reads the French literature, and France was at the center of medicine at that time, French literature up to about the middle of the 19th century, again and again they talk about taking patients to the autopsy room, hoping they will die before they go to the autopsy room. But the point was to correlate the physical examination with what they see at autopsy. The doctors themselves did the autopsies. The Germans take over in the middle of the century because meticulous science and microscopy and biochemistry are now required. And scientific physicians, especially at the Vienna General Hospital in Berlin and Freiburg and other places, are really writing that the usefulness of medicine is for the physician. The physician has a riddle to solve, and the patient himself, herself, is a vehicle for that solution. This continues right through the entire 19th century. This is the leaders of medicine, local physicians, the doctors caring for patients out in the community, continue to understand the importance of the goodness of the physician, but the leaders of medical science, the leaders of medical practice simply couldn't conceive that that was of any importance. And when you look at 19th century medical history, you realize that if you're an American physician, there was nothing to be learned in America. There were, except for the invention of anesthesia, which was accomplished by a couple of dentists in the 1840s, no contribution had been made by our country to medicine. So if you wanted to study medicine, you could go to Paris, which many people did, and in the latter part of the century, you could go to Vienna or Berlin or one of the German-speaking countries. We have statistics about this. Between 1870 and the First World War, 15,000 American physicians traveled to the German-speaking countries, not for a little 2-week interlude, but they would work there for 6 months, a year, sometimes 2 years. And the leaders of academic medicine came out of this group exposed to the notion of therapeutic nihilism. So technology has begun to come in. Antisepsis is discovered by Lister in 1867 based on some work by Pasteur. Koch comes along very shortly thereafter, and medicine is now completely scienceized. This hasn't, again, hit physicians in the communities, but it's the way all of academic medicine and medicine in the journals of those days is talked about. We have lost the Greek notions. In 1895, X-ray is invented. So now we've got the stethoscope, we've got X-ray, and we've got people talking about objective data, separating that subjectivity, which was taking the history, doing the very subjective physical examination. That's all separated from what the academic physicians were trying to do, which is by lab work, by X-ray, try to distance themselves so that one's subjectivity, which of course enters so much into that important factor of judgment, one's subjectivity is separated out from medicine, and that has characterized medicine ever since. One of the hardest blows that was inflicted on the Greek thoughts about the personal role of the physician is made by the Flexner Report in 1910. You all know the story. A teacher, actually a secondary school teacher from Lexington, Kentucky, is given a lot of money by the Carnegie and the Rockefeller Foundations. He studies all 155 medical schools, most of which were proprietary, just run by doctors in the United States and Canada, and he finds out that out in the periphery there's not enough science, and we must change everything in medical teaching to scientific teaching. And that's really almost the death knell. And as you look more and more at academic medicine, although there are individual instances of people coming along and talking about the importance of goodness, by and large, that is not the factor. The major factor is distancing oneself. We have Hermann Notnagel at the University of Vienna in the late 19th century saying to his students, he was had a big influence on Freud, he was one of Freud's teachers of internal medicine, saying to his students that to be a great physician, one must be a great human being. That's a direct quote from Notnagel. We have Francis Well Peabody addressing a class of Harvard medical students in 1921, and this famous quote that virtually everybody here, I believe, has heard, that the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. He, and this is very little known, was a patient at the same time he was a professor of medicine at Harvard. At the time he said this at the commencement ceremony, he was dying of colon carcinoma. So he really understood this from both sides. But that's unusual. That's really unique. There are very few academic cries in the wilderness. There is a speech given at the American College of Physicians. I can't remember which it was. It wasn't the AMA. In the late 1820s, called "The Physician Himself as a Therapeutic Agent." So some people are thinking about it, but that is not the trend in science. Then we enter, in the 1960s, after all of this prologue and prelude, what so many of us have come to think of as the age of the image. We diagnose by imaging, X-ray, MRI, ultrasound, whatever it may be, CAT scans, and laboratory studies. We treat by drugs and image-directed invasion of the body cavities and of tubular structures. And before long, we have reached the age of the molecule. These have brought us to the greatness of modern medicine, most particularly American medicine, which, in spite of what some of our critics talk about, is the finest medicine in the world, and my guess is will always be the finest medicine in the world. We enter the age of the riddle of diagnosis, the riddle of therapy. What's it going to be? It's a little reminiscent of the early 19th century, except therapy is very important. But young people are trained to use objective criteria, objective studies. Physical examination, as so many people here know, has become a dying art. History-taking has become a dying art. I believe Abe Verghese talked about this last year, one of the leading proponents of turning things around. The art and the goodness are largely lost. We live in an era of the dominance, the hegemony, I might say, of science. So what has been done about that? Many educators have recognized this problem, and so what are the reactions? There has been a return to Hippocratic idealism. People talk about this a lot. The white coat ceremony that the Gold Foundation began. Awards to faculty and students for humanistic medicine. Sometimes very hard to find the right person to give this to, but nevertheless, it is always given. The growth of bioethics in the 1960s, out of clear blue, the field of bioethics appears. Maybe we can do something about it. Hospice begins. You remember Cicely Saunders started this at St. Luke's and St. Christopher's in London in 1967. Teaching humanities and ethics to medical students, unfortunately always first and second year medical students, before the excitement of the wards takes over. And, of course, the Patient Self-Determination Act of, I believe it was 1990, in which patients are allowed to decide what kind of treatment they will get if dangerously ill. Has anything really changed? As part of this study, I carefully evaluated the state of things as they are now and came up, we're going back to the French, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more it changes, the more it's really the same thing. The distancing, the riddle, the technology. Doctors in training have largely become shift workers, as you all know. The advent of hospitalists has created for us a cadre of very highly trained, very skillful physicians, but physicians who do not know the values, the backgrounds, the intimate details of the way their patients look at the world and find it difficult to help patients make decisions. So what are the solutions? What possible solutions can there be? Obviously, we need the training of far, far, far more family physicians. We need a reorganization of medicine. We need to restore what I like to call the pastoral role of the physician truly a healer, and probably more than anything else. We need a new Flexner report, but this time not about medical education, but about everything, something that will cost hundreds of millions of dollars and involve many people studying the process. You know, our medical system was not organized. It just grew like Topsy, a Band-Aid here, a solution there, a bill and an act there. We need to reorganize from the bottom up and from the top down. And during all of their studies and recommendations, the chosen experts, the chosen authorities should be guided by the admonition of the ancient Hippocratic authors, I believe, to whom medicine was known as the art of medicine, and prognostication was one of its most highly regarded skills. Medicine now, no less than at that time, is the art of nurturing the sick back to a state of health and to recognize when it's impossible to do so. Should that be the case, when that is the case, ways must be found to demedicalize the final days or weeks, to nurture the dying and those who love them, and by this means to nurture ourselves. The real truth of healing lies in the nurture. Thank you so much for this great privilege. Mahalo, as we say here in Honolulu.
Dr. Nuland, thank you very much for those insightful comments. And I would just like to suggest that in your case, you should definitely use your hands, not your head, when you hold an elevator door open. We do have time for a few questions if people would like to pose some. Can we have the lights up, please? I don't know if we have a microphone, but if people want to come up and ask a question, that would be fine. Yes. Mandatory what? The question is, what are the essential books for a well-read physician to have read?
Yes, what should a well-read physician who is seeking the notion of a certain moral persona should read? Well, in the first place, I think a standard textbook on the history of medicine is very important. There are many dry-as-bones histories of medicine. I know that it sounds very much self-interested, but why don't you read a book called Doctors, the Biography of Medicine, that was referred to by Dr. Gutterman in the introduction by a fellow named Nuland, who feels such an empathy with those who have come before us in medicine that he almost identifies with each one of these people. I think it's essential to read the work of William Osler. There are a number of books consisting of series of his essays. The best collection I know comes under the title of Equanimitas. Of course, everything Osler wrote, if you look at it critically, is for the physician. He talks a lot about the physician and very little about patients as you go between the lines. But he does emphasize the importance of the physician's moral status. I would read anything that Walter B. Cannon wrote. He wrote a wonderful book in about 1920 called The Wisdom of the Body, how the body understands how to heal itself. He's the man, as you'll recall, who invented the word homeostasis, which was what the Greeks first told us about. The way to make people healthy again is to restore balances. They had a little different idea of balance than we do. But those are primarily, that'll get you started and keep you going for a good long time.
What should we be doing with regards to this modern era of technology, and I've done it for 30 years, technology in the practice of medicine in order to avoid the doomsday scenario of disconnecting us completely from our patients?
When I was in training, which was probably about 3 decades before you were in training, we used to talk about bedside rounds. But of course, our professors never made bedside rounds, except for a very few. They made bed-end rounds. They would stand at the bottom of the patient's bed, at the foot of the patient's bed, ask questions, do a physical examination showing how it was done. But except for Paul Beeson and a few others at Yale and in other places, there were always one or two Paul Beesons, nobody sat at the side, on the side of the patient's bed, perhaps held the patient's hand, looked into the patient's eyes, and didn't call him George, but called him Mr. Wilson. They look to us for this kind of thing. They model themselves after us. Unfortunately, most young physicians, and this is a necessity of the way training programs are being taught by people a year or two older than they are, the chief resident or the newest attending. I think it's for those of us who are perhaps of middle-aged and beyond to take this aspect of medicine very, very seriously. I love to tell the story of my own making rounds with the usual, the retinue of young people behind me. And it was not uncommon for me if, in those days, people stayed in the hospital a lot longer. If I came to a patient who was close to death from a malignancy or whatever, saying to the group, well, why don't we let Mrs. Jones rest? We'll go to the next patient. And the next patient was usually someone on whom I had achieved some miraculous cure, as surgeons always do. She'd had a horrible ectomy and, was doing well from this. And wouldn't it have been better, this was in my early days, if I had walked in to this dying woman and talked with her and had the students see that and held her hand and talked about what she expected might happen to her, perhaps even in the future life. But I didn't do that. It took me till well into middle age before I'd gotten to that. That's the kind of thing that people of essentially the age group that you all should be doing.
Dr. Ibrahim?
Dr. Nuland, thank you so much. I'd like to thank you so much for this lecture. It was really very wonderful. And I'd like to thank you for mentioning some of the Arab physicians. I come from Saudi Arabia. It made me feel proud mentioning Abyssinia, Razi, and Maimonides. And the question is, even though this sounds like music to our ears and every physician does have the intention of practicing this ethical medicine, you're confronted with the hard reality when you go to your hospital and clinics and the RVU systems and the economics of medicine and the pressure for you to generate a certain income and see a certain number of patients in your clinics. How would you advise physicians to reconcile these two concepts?
2 years ago, I wrote this book, How We Die, in 1994, about the American way of dying and the relationship of physicians to the last chapters of life. And I decided that since 16 years had passed, or the publishers decided I should write a new chapter catching up to what had happened in 16 years. And it was very, very discouraging. All the things that you have so appropriately mentioned, including administrators making rounds on all of our patients. Jerry Groupman once said to me, as we were talking about the very problems you're bringing up, they don't know who we are. They don't know who doctors are. They don't know how we think. And his now famous book, How Doctors Think. I say that there have to be revolutionaries among us. I think there have to be some people who are in the vanguard of saying, I am going to sit at the bedside, I am going to take, as a middle-aged physician, great awareness of my moral responsibilities, and I don't care if the hospital administrators come down on me like a ton of bricks. This is what I'm going to do. It's easy for me, since I'm retired, to say these things, but I was able to do it during perhaps my last 10 years of active practice, way back in the 1880s when things weren't as bad as they are now. So, not nearly as bad. So I would encourage people to be revolutionaries. Enormous change can take place with a few revolutionaries, and with your origins in Arabic countries, you have seen it. the Arab Spring. Well, why don't we have an Arab Spring until such time as that new Flexner report can be carried out? Dan Callahan, who is the director, not the director, but the founder of the Hastings Institute, the great bioethics think tank, and I wrote an article for the New Republic that was published in May about a complete revamping of the healthcare system. I hate to be so self-referential, but that just means that I'm one of the leaders of the Arab Spring, and I want everybody here to be a leader of the Arab Spring in medicine until this real revolution takes place. And thank goodness we have someone here from HHS who's going to help us with that.
Dr. Nuland, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending the session.